Welcome. My name is Alicia Miller. I'm Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at Digital Green. I think we have a few people kind of continuing to flow in, but we want to get started right away. You are all, just to make sure you're in the right place, we are hosting this panel today on how decentralization and Web3 opens new doors for farmer data sovereignty in agriculture. We're really pleased that the organizers have given us this opportunity to have this conversation, and I think we have a great panel for you today. So before we jump in, just a couple of things. First is I'd like our organizers to launch our first poll. We know that we're covering two topics that are possibly unfamiliar to many of you. So we want to know who's in the room. So the first poll should be coming up here shortly, and we'll give it a couple of minutes. It relates to the concept of data sovereignty in your organizations. The second thing, as that poll is getting queued up and people are joining us, is please really actively use the chat. We know some of you have already submitted some questions, and some of the organizers have shared those, and we've seen them, and we'll try to do our best to kind of answer them. We may not get to all of the questions here today, but we hope it's a robust conversation. I encourage you to use the chat and the Whova app. And then finally, we're going to be giving really kind of brief just titles of the panelists in our conversation to save extra time for the dialogue. So please look into the chat or in the Whova app to see who we have on the panel today. So then moving into why are we here? Our goals for the session are to deepen our collective understanding of data sovereignty and Web 3.0. We think these are both really important concepts, and they can be intimidating or confusing or just unfamiliar. So we want to make sure that there's a deepened understanding of that, so we can think about what these mean for the agriculture sector and for small scale producers in particular. I think there was a question before the panel asking if there was just a lot of hype around this. So I think there's a very real question of does this apply actually to the work we do? Another thing is to learn about some tangible programs, activities, and applications of these different concepts. That's things that are already happening now and things that are planned. And then I would just say kind of my own personal goal is to demystify these concepts a little bit and really spark your curiosity so that you want to learn more, rather than maybe for some people these could be confusing and maybe they're missing an opportunity. So I think the poll might still be kind of coming up. So while that's happening, I'm just going to give a couple of definitions, and then we're going to jump right into the panel. Here's poll one. So this is about your organization. How would you best define your organization? You know, would you say my organization does not have a defined policy or position on data ownership and data sovereignty? My organization's developing policies, or my organization has a well-defined data ownership and data sovereignty policy? So take a minute to answer that question. And while we're doing that, what is data sovereignty? I know there was another discussion that was earlier in this conference that already went over this, but just to say, data sovereignty is not a concept that has an agreed definition. There are a lot of different definitions. I looked at a data sovereignty review with the authors were Hummel, Braun, and Tretter, if you decide you want to look. And they basically said data sovereignty alludes to values and principles about how different people and in what contexts data can be shared. So it relates to meaningful control over data, ownership of data, and claims to data. We'll talk more about what this means here, but just to say that this is an evolving concept that means slightly different things to different people. So it looks like here with the poll that we have right now, we kind of have a mix. We have some people saying, the majority saying that the organization are developing policies around this, with some already having a well-defined policy and some still kind of learning about this. So for our panelists, that's the mix of who we have in the room. If we could launch the second poll, I know we're kind of moving quickly through this, that would be great. The second poll relates to Web3. And we kind of want to have a sense of what people know about this. So with Web3, I'm going to do a very high-level job here saying that we are currently living in a Web 2.0 world, which I bet almost everyone here knows. The Web 1.0 was really in the 90s. Very basic kind of web pages were developing then. Web 2, where we currently are, ushered in a lot of functionality and integration and centralization. but it also raised issues around trust and permission and autonomy. And so we're now moving toward a Web3 world, which really is leveraging decentralization, trustless and permissionless systems. This is going to enable, or is enabling, greater use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and it's leveraging the super connectivity that we have around the world. And I will let people more expert than me define it further than that, but you'll see we have a poll running right now. How new are you to Web3? You're very new to it, don't know anything about it. I'm familiar, but don't know how this applies to us. Or I'm already building solutions in Web3. So people are answering that right now. I think I'm going to let it go a couple more minutes another minute. And then we will move into our first kind of panelist. So I'm going to tee up the first question to Ricken Gandhi, the co-founder of Digital Green and our CEO, executive director. And Ricken, as I'm waiting for this poll to finish, the question is going to be to you. We just finished a strategy refresh, and data control and data sovereignty is a core theme. And we're also increasingly really interested in this idea of decentralization. And so for everybody in the room, could you kind of go further than I did in defining these concepts and linking them to the work that we do? And I'm going to end the poll now so that you can see the results. And it looks like we have mostly people who are fairly new to Web3 or have some familiarity, and sort of a pretty limited number that are already building in Web3, which sounds about right. So Ricken, over to you. Why is this kind of core to what we're doing, and how does this relate to the overall conversation we're having in this conference?
Thanks, Alicia, and thanks to everyone for joining, as well as our fellow panelists in this session. To give a bit about the history about Digital Green, we've mostly focused on the Web 2.0 space. Like many organizations, we partnered with government extension providers, and we worked with them to strengthen the efficacy of their extension programs using technology. In our case, using videos that are by and for farmers to share improved practices more efficiently. And along the way, a lot of data is also generated about what farmers are getting exposed to, what practices they adopt. And this is all done in concert with the government extension programs, their extension staff on the ground, the various types of farmer groups and self-help groups that those extension programs have brought together. And we've been able to show significant scale and impact, reaching 2 million farmers and showing significant improvements in productivity. But one of the realizations that we had over the last couple of years is that obviously there's not just the government extension program or just Digital Green in these ecosystems that we're working in. There's so many more new actors in both the public, private, and civil society sectors who are engaging with these farming communities across a range of agricultural extension to input provision to credit, insurance, offtake marketing. And in our new strategy, what we're seeking to do is to say, how can we help to enable that wider ecosystem and start really from these farmers and these farmer organizations, because the value of data and the agency and collective bargaining capacity of these individuals is most had when they are brought together in groups. And the great thing is that many of these groups have been brought together via government extension programs, NGO, private sector, even the farmers' own initiatives into cooperative or farmer producer organization types of structures. And to say, how can these groups, how can they digitize their own data for their own use and for their own functioning, whether that be how they govern and interact with their membership, and also how they serve various functions on behalf of their members, whether that is to connect with input or offtake markets. And how can data, more specifically, be put into the hands of these organizations so that they're the ones who can decide how that data is shared and controlled, and in some cases, perhaps even monetized. And so what we're looking to do is essentially flip the model that has been the core of our approach of working with government extension, having these government extension agents share advisory messages amongst these farmer groups and collecting data to inform and target the extension programs, but rather put that data into the hands of these collectives of women's self-help groups, of farmer producer organizations, and say, how can they have the capacity built so that they can understand the value of their own data, and how can they leverage it for their own use in the first place? And then number two, how can they also get value by being able to share that same data with this wider ecosystem of so many more actors that now exist in the proximity of these communities, and that can unlock new sources of value for them. And that's what we mean by agency, is really to say, how can these communities have that choice and that control over their own data? And how can some of these tools that the Web3 world enables be leveraged by these same groups and not be arbitrated by brokers or others from the top down?
Great, thanks, Rickon. And just a note for all of the panelists as we talk, if you want to give examples of when we say Web3 technology, what we mean, we'll be bringing those in, but feel free to kind of add those as you talk, just since we have a little bit less familiarity with that concept. So I'm going to move to our second panelist. We'll kind of go through each with an opening question, and then we'll have a conversation. I'm so pleased to bring Eliane Ubalajaro into the conversation. She's the Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age, and she's also the Global Hub Director for Future Earth Canada. Eliane, we're really pleased to have you, and I think Rickon talked about decentralizing control over data, but also decentralizing sort of the power that comes with data, which is so valuable. So as it relates to sort of decentralized data and infrastructure in the agriculture sector, what kinds of trade-offs do you see? Who's making trade-offs today? Who's going to be making trade-offs if we move in this direction of Web3 technology?
So one of the things that's really critical is how do we ensure a level playing field for smallholders to be engaging at the same level as everybody else? So it's clear that decentralization should theoretically move power away from the large ag tech global corporations to smallholder farmers, to cooperatives, to self-help groups. But the intent is, how do we ensure that that process happens in a way that really engages everyone in ways that allows everybody to have essential actionable insights that are generated? How do we ensure that we have governance systems that at the local and global level create enabling conditions for all players to be able to have access? It's really critical to ensure, do we all have equal availability to broadband to be able to play in this space? How affordable is it to be able to access data? What are the adoption strategies that need to be looked at that smallholder level to ensure that the needed capabilities and tools and incentives are in place to access connectivity? And how do we connect them to a agricultural space that becomes more sustainable in the long run? So it's also the need to link it to planetary health and how we collectively work together to have more climate resilient agriculture. And so the intent for me is really moving towards a more knowledge intensive framework that has smallholder farmers as not only users, but producers of knowledge, and have them benefit from it. Ideally, in an ideal system for me, we would have a system that allows them to benefit not only through the knowledge they generate, but also through their contributions to making us more climate resilient, carbon sequestration. And so also, how do we create the needed mechanisms to allow passive income to flow when farmers are adopting more sustainable practices that help us decrease the 30% contribution agriculture has to greenhouse gas emissions? And so it's really about how do we have a more distributed power base around how we all gain insights from data, and that all decisions, especially from the bottom up, are data informed and not necessarily data driven, but informed by data. And also, how do we look at the complexity of working in systems that hopefully should become more regenerative in terms of agriculture. And so it's going away from the simplicity of, okay, how do we decrease, cost of inputs from remote sensing, to actually how do we create practices that produce more intelligent agriculture that is climate resilient and is helping us live within planetary boundaries. So it's also how smallholder farmers as a service can contribute to us living healthier collectively. And so there are great opportunities for all. Obviously, because of the need for intermediaries that are going to be supporting and building the capacities for farmers, it's really critical that even though, we have systems that we call trustless that operate, we need to be able to engage smallholder farmers so that they trust that involving their time and energy and contributing to collective intelligence will produce benefits to them. So I do believe that the issue of trust remains really critical in terms of how do we establish inclusive innovation systems that really allow us to harness Web 3.0 so that we create greater collaborative systems that are participatory, that allow engaging smallholder farmers as co-creators of the innovation systems we need to accelerate the transition towards more knowledge-intensive agriculture.
Thank you so much. And there was a lot there, but just a couple things I want to kind of call out and make sure we keep carrying forward, which is this requires to move in the direction of Web3, where individuals have greater agency and are also able to sort of contribute their data and get value out of that data in new ways. We have to be investing in sort of the existing inequalities around even things like connectivity, but then also capabilities in this space. And then even beyond that, we can't assume, and we should not assume, to our peril, we assume that entering data is something that doesn't involve a cost. There is a time cost, and I need to be rewarded for the time that I put in very clearly. And a lot of these new Web 3.0 mechanisms don't always have an obvious sort of value if you're new to it, or maybe yet haven't defined how we monetize some of the Web 3.0 technology. So I just want to point out a few of those things that I heard you say there, and hopefully we keep building on those as we go. Thanks so much. So our next panelist is Hemendra Mathur. He's co-founder of ThinkAg and venture partner at Bharat Innovation Fund. Hemendra, you're very, very involved in the investment space in ag tech in India. And we know there's just a ton of excitement and investment going on in India, but there's also a lot of potential redundancy. There's maybe even confusion about how all of these innovations kind of play together. And decentralization, I think a lot of people think about decentralization as ushering in perhaps confusion. There's some clarity with centralization. So I wondered if you could talk from sort of a systems level about how you see kind of interest evolving in this space in India, what this means in ag tech, and how is the idea of decentralized digital infrastructure kind of contributing in that space? So welcome to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia, and a very good question. Clearly, I think ag tech is leapfrogging in Indian market. We are seeing more than 1,000 startups already in Indian agri-tech. Most of them have come in last 3 to 4 years and doing some phenomenal job. And I strongly believe agri-tech has a huge role to play in improving farmers' livelihood. And specifically to a question on decentralization, let me give you some data points here. If you look at India's village economy, there are about 600,000 villages in India. And each village agricultural output, when I say agricultural output, staples, vegetables, fruits, milk, fibers, they all put together on an average is $1 million from each village, right? And the ambition of this nation, especially this current government, is to double that up. So it means that $1 million has to go to $2 million, right? At the village level. Now, how that will happen? And that's where I want to relate what agri-techs are doing. So first and foremost, for producing $1 million worth of output, you need to buy inputs worth $300,000 to $400,000, right? Now, as of now, farmers are buying on, I would say, gut feel. They don't have data to support, to say, I need this much of urea, I need to spray pesticide at so and so time. So it's more past experiences and some gut feel decisions. And that's where I feel that there's a lot of application of data, especially hyper local data about soil health, about plant health, about the weather data. And that's where this decentralization becomes extremely critical. That decentralization could be at the field level, at the village level, or maybe at the cluster level. But this data becomes extremely critical to optimize the cost of input. Then, so I think there are like a bunch of startups who are doing this, right? And we need to optimize the cost of input. There are a lot of agri-input e-commerce platforms who are telling farmer what are the best inputs to buy, when you should use it. And I think that can drive a lot of savings for farmer, improving their bottom line, right? Then most of these inputs are sold on credit. Unfortunately, the cost of credit, especially from non-institutional sources in India, is about 24% to 60% per year. Tell me how many businesses in the world can make money if the cost of capital is so high. So how do we reduce that cost of capital, right? Again, you need a lot of data here, right? Which is not there. That's why bankers are kind of, I would say, feel hesitant to lend to this sector, right? So that is also very important component of the data as a potential use case in lending and also insurance. And finally, if you want to double the farmer income, you need to give him option to sell more efficiently. Right now, farmer is selling to the nearest market yard, which is within 30 to 40 kilometers, and selling mostly as commodity, right? So you need to empower the farmers to sell more efficiently, hopefully to more buyers, helping him with better price discovery. And that can really open up the opportunities, and also giving him opportunity to do some bit of value addition and processing at the farm level. So that's the decentralized physical infrastructure. So I think that itself is a huge opportunity. So I think all I want to say that with decentralization, our village economy can really, grow quite a bit. The ownership of the data, how it is going to be collected, how it need to be stored, how it need to be shared. Of course, those are the parameters we are still thinking about it. Of course, a lot of APIs are going to come from the agri-tech ecosystem, which are very good at processing the data. I don't think farmers have the wherewithal, because it does involve some bit of data analytics tools. But I think there's no question farmer can own it, farmer can use it, and farmer can share it with the ecosystem players whom they believe are complementary to what they're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think a lot of an important piece that you highlighted there, a lot of good stuff to point to. But one thing you mentioned is that really for us to make better use of the different kind of ag tech innovations that are out there, whether it's connecting farmers to markets or trying to help them with input selection or anything else, to do that more effectively and to better match needs with products, we need more specific, very local data. And so we need decentralized systems and ways of farmers to be able to provide that data in an easier way, so that every time they're deciding to deal with a different service provider, they're not having to replicate and generate all of this information. So you pointed, in order for us to fully realize the power of so much ag tech innovation, we need that decentralized data. And so then that means that individuals have to be able to own and manage that differently. So thank you. So for our final panelists here, we're going to go to Revathi Sharma Kollegala. Revathi is Executive Director of the Regen Foundation. And I think she'll bring in a very sort of specific way that sort of this decentralization is marrying with climate smart solutions and incentives when she talks about what Regen Foundation does. But Revathi, a question that I want to kind of put to you, in addition to kind of making sure you explain a bit about the Regen network, is one of the projects we're working with right now is partnering with the Self-Employed Women's Association to gather information that can inform the design of digital tools that really supports their decision making, layering on top of how they already make decisions and building solutions for them, from what I understand. Can you talk about what you've been learning in that consultative, collaborative process? This goes back to what Eliane said, that we have to like engage farmers themselves to co-create with us. So would love to hear what you're learning, and then also just linking up some of these ideas in a very concrete way with Regen.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And let me actually start with explaining a little bit more of the context for that, because that will help us understand, put in place sort of what we are learning a little bit more. So this organization is called SEWA Cooperative Federation, Self-Employed Women's Association. It's a federation of a lot of grassroots cooperatives. It's been in existence for over 3 decades. It's headquartered in India, but spread across geographically over 18 states. So it was born, I don't know, in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was this cooperative movement and a surge of similar grassroots cooperatives in India. And this incredibly brave lady called Elaben created this association for informal workers who are women to get together. And it's built on that social fabric. And because it's a federation, there are several cooperatives, and they are by nature distributed or decentralized, if we want to sort of use the buzzword here. But it was born well before the digitization era, right? So our research project looks at building on the existing cooperative governance practices that's come in there and is very strongly ingrained in them, and using that for the governance of EI systems to create an inclusive data governance toolkit. And we're specifically looking at agricultural systems. So something that's very SEWA specific is that they have a methodology of called community leaders, which is called Agevans. So they identify these leaders in every new region where a cooperative is found, and they are the ones who sort of are the community glue for that particular region. And then they bring in insights from the region to the larger federation, and they also help sort of bi-directional information flow. And they're usually committed to making sure that the power is not centralized with them. And this comes naturally to these folks who are these kinds of community leaders. And what we found as we looked at sort of where technology platforms are and how that interfaces with these social structures is identifying these already inherent social dynamics. Going back to what Eliane was saying, I think on the technology level, we understand fairly well, somewhat, how to implement decentralization. But on the social level, it requires a lot more intention and some more thought, which I think we don't have, especially when we look at the agricultural context. The eventual beneficiary, the farmer tilling the land, is not going to be the average person that you would think of who's a Web3 consumer, who will buy a ledger hardware wallet and go jump through the hoops required to, use it, create a wallet, and be really secure in terms of cyber practices and vote on the ledger and so on and so forth. So we find that one, there is a certain level of digital literacy training required, and you have to embed that with the social systems to identify these dynamic members who are already used to representing the needs of the community, except now that they would just do that digitally and perhaps online. And this connection was really important. To Eliane's point, these are people with families and out in the fields all day, and any new technology tool that we use is one additional thing that they have to do, and it really just has to make what they're already doing easier or fit into it very easily. So I go in the morning to the field, and at noon, I meet with the neighbors, and we have this village meeting under the banyan tree. Then that's where I meet with the community leader, and that's where you have to have this social conversation about, hey, here's how my crops are doing, and what is the information on the market right now, and should we look at what you're finding from the app on should I change my tilling cycle or the seed cycle, that kind of thing. On the Region Foundation, I'm more directly involved with Web3. It's part of this crypto marketplace called Region Network, which enables investment in ecological regeneration. On behalf of Region Network, we particularly steward this program, which gives away 30% of the tokens to underrepresented stakeholders, which includes farmers and land steward communities, essentially allowing them to co-own the ecosystem for about 30%. So something that we are finding here, and sort of the intersection point, is that there is this power in Web3 technology to for the agricultural communities to benefit directly from the larger climate space, ag tech space, and all the resources and benefits there. And there is a need to also think through that, because as we steward the program, or everything that I mentioned before about the tech needing to be accessible, we certainly have to keep that in mind. And it's something that we keep learning as we go.
Thanks, Revati. And really appreciate a number of the points that you brought in there, especially around digital literacy, which I hope we can kind of talk more about. Like, what does that end up looking like, for example, in the communities that we're working with? What are we learning from that already? We have a few questions coming in. I want to encourage people to keep them coming in, but I'm going to kind of actually take kind of a moderator's privilege here, and Rick, and put you on the spot a little bit, because we saw in the poll when people were first joining that Web3 was actually less familiar than the concept of data sovereignty, or really worrying, concerning ourselves with data ownership within our organizations, which is great, that people, have come from organizations that are so committed to protecting the data of individuals. So I want to go to the Web3 space. If people, walk away from this meeting and still feel like they don't know what Web3 means in concrete terms, like what are some of the specific tools, then we'll have missed an opportunity here. So could I ask you to give very simple definitions in your own words about kind of how concepts like NFTs, like what is an NFT? What is crypto? I know I'm throwing huge ideas here. What's a ledger? And then I'm going to say, how does that, pick an example of how that relates to small scale producers. And Revati is laughing because these are massive conversations, massive talking points. So I'm asking him to boil it down. But the reason I'm doing it is because I think, to my point about demystifying, somebody might hear a non-fungible token and think, one, I have no idea what that means. And two, I don't think that has anything to do with a farmer or their livelihood. And so I would love for you to just take a minute, because we've referred to some of these things in the conversation so far, but we haven't actually done much in the way of nailing them down. So putting you on the spot, and then I'll go to some of the other panelists to see if they want to add to this and get concrete about these ideas and examples.
Sure. I think basically, like, I would say that there's maybe there is like huge concepts here, and probably Revati and others can chime in more. But so one element is around how to think about how data is traditionally stored. So traditionally, data is stored in a very centralized fashion in a particular database that an organization might host, perhaps on the cloud, like on Amazon Web Services or Azure, or on some local server. And that's one piece of the puzzle that in the Web3 world can be decentralized with what folks call the distributed ledger, right? Or a blockchain, such that there's not a single host or owner of the data, but that it is a distributed ownership of the data. The second thing I would say is that there's this really important notion of smart contracts, which basically embeds within software certain types of logical parameters with respect to like how certain if then type of conditions of logic might result in certain types of outcomes, right? Whether that is an advisory message or a credit score or something like that. Those things, right, that typically were done in a manual process can be codified and automated in software so that based on some of this data, certain rules can be enforceable. And it doesn't have to just be like of these types of things. It can also be related to governance. And that's like a third concept that I would bring in, which is this notion of decentralized autonomous organizations, so-called DAOs. And the way to think about that is basically a digital twin of these farmer groups or these self-help groups, wherein some of the governance type of functionality that a self-help group might have in terms of perhaps electing its members or determining membership fees or dividend distributions, those kind of things via a smart contract can be codified into a DAO type of structure. I would say that there's a spectrum of what one can consider for decentralization. What doesn't need to kind of go to the extreme, and almost to Revati's point, especially amongst these type of small scale producer groups that we're working with, we probably shouldn't expect that in the immediate term that each individual farmer is going to have to record their own data, set up their own smart contract, deal with like a DAO system. No, there's probably going to be stewards that are perhaps the real world extension agents or the farmer producer group officers who can serve as intermediaries. And even there can be a process of codifying how consent is given to and trust is given to these people by the individual farmers to ensure that their interests are not going to be exploited. And even when it comes to, like, so let's say data storage, one extreme is like the blockchain, and another one is a very closed database, right, of a proprietary service provider. But there can be in-between options too, right? Like how in India, for instance, there's this notion that the Indian government has of a digital locker for individuals to maintain their driver license and university or academic credentials and be able to use that when they're applying to this or that loan or some other purpose. Similarly, one can think of like half steps to getting to like that maybe eventual more decentralized world that can begin to at least begin to address some of the issues that we see right in the world, right? Which is today, a lot of farmers are starting to work with companies and government where their data is being digitized, but they're being stuck in a walled garden. And if they want to switch to another credit organization because it offers a better loan term, or a different offtake buyer who might be able to offer them a better price. Today, they're sort of stuck sometimes in these proprietary systems. But even just that basic goal of having the ability to port your data to different systems can be an initial step towards creating greater agency than what we have today.
Thanks, Ricken. And thanks for taking my super big question and breaking it down into some smaller pieces people can hopefully digest. I think all the speakers will keep doing that. I'm going to go back through the same order we did. So I'm going to put people on notice of what I'm doing. Eliane, I'm going to come to you next, and then Revati, this question that was asked in the chat, I have some pieces I might come to there, but I really want you to give us an example of how this Web3 technology could actually translate to cash in hand. So I'm going to come to you after Eliane. Eliane, the question I wanted to pose to you is, you're focused on sustainability, and I'm wondering if, as you referred to the ways that this technology and decentralization can really empower people, and you talked about some of the things that we need to do to make sure that potential is realized. Can you give some concrete examples at the intersection with climate resilience of how, like, what excites you about Web3 technology and how that might really improve farmer resilience if we do it well, right? If we're co-designing with farmers and they have capabilities, what new possibilities does this open up that you get excited about?
So one of the things that really excites me is how we create interoperable systems between our agriculture production system and countries' national determined targets in terms of what's being done by private, nonprofit, and government sector. And how do we make it as cheap as possible for all farmers who are going towards more climate regenerative, carbon sequestration systems, to have, transparent, automated transmission of their data so that they can get passive income from their contributions to carbon sequestration. And so what I think is very critical is there's need, for work that contributes to the global commons and to commons in each country that make it possible to create, fair and care principle-based data systems that allow this type of data that is so crucial to understand how all countries are contributing to their national determined targets, can really align with smallholder farmers and their powers in terms of being contributors to carbon sequestration around the world. Because one of the issues right now is how we value carbon sequestration, how farmers get paid. It really requires farmers to be already embedded in systems that are already in place. And so for farmers to access these pools of funding that are going to be really critical to scale and accelerate how we need to move towards net zero, we have to create these automated, transparent systems that engage farmers to really become critical leaders of how we move forward for a more climate resilient world in terms of production, in terms of value chain, decreasing food loss, in terms of how that also contributes waste that's happened. And so it's really critical that farmers get rewarded for the values they can bring in greening our economies globally. We can't hear you for some reason. Yeah, no, we can't hear you. Yeah, we can't hear you, but I'm sure. Oh, yes, we can hear you now.
Now you can hear me. I don't know why, but it said my microphone changed. Thank you, Eliane. Apologies for that little technical interruption. Revathi, I want to go to you and talk about how do farmers actually make money in a concrete sense? And also, I think there's a point here that is in the chat and is also something Ricken mentioned, which is in terms of how farmers are making money and how this happens in a passive way eventually, what are the role of kind of some key individuals, the people who are helping to steward this community data? So if you could kind of explain your model, but then also who's helping to collect this data right now?
Sure. I think, in the context that Eliane mentioned, and I'll get your name right with more tries, I promise. It's important to remember that often in the context that we're talking about, that especially I work in, is agriculture and food systems meets climate. It almost happens accidentally. You don't, as a farmer, when I have a farm, I don't go around saying, hey, I want to get payment for ecosystem services or to green the economy. Usually it starts with, I am affected by climate. I don't know what to do. I don't have enough water. The temperatures are rising, or the rain pattern is so erratic. My tilling and harvesting seasons is gone. So I have to think of different crops and different methods and just make sure my finances line up, right? So where the region network ecosystem works there is we help finance this initial stage of converting to practices that are more sustainable, organic, healthier for the planet and for the land, and just ecological regeneration is a fancy way to put it. And farmers working with the land is one aspect of it. There's also like ocean conservation and so on and so forth. But for the purposes of this discussion, I think that's relevant. And what's also important here is there are two things that farmers really need here. One is the actual money to shift their practices, so they don't have to put things from their own hand and increase the risk that they already have from climate. And second is information and handholding. I mean, what crop should I be doing? What practices should I be using, right? Both of these. And so in the region ecosystem, these two go hand in hand. If you look at the traditional sustainability world, there are very thorough program guides of carbon credits where you have specific ways of doing things. What is equivalent in carbon? What does it mean to the planet? And how can we translate that to, hard cash and pay people who are doing it? In the region ecosystem, that it's intentionally built using the power of decentralization to make it community owned and governed, which means somebody can come in and say, here is a practice that we've had from a long time on how we grow rice in a sustainable manner. This is not there in any of these international databases because it takes a whole process, but we think it's really important. It'll prevent stubble burning or whatnot, and it'll also reduce the water that's needed for paddy fields, for instance. And we really want farmers to earn at least so many rupees per acre to be able to switch over to this, and when they do this in a verifiable manner. So, and they can code that in so many ways and make sure that there is data on what that verification really means and call that an eco credit. And so usually what has happened so far is we've had field partners and organizations who are already doing this in the fields, put it up on the ledger, and they work with the farmers, and they get sort of the on their end money as payment for these ecosystem services, as the industry terminology goes. But I also think that where we're moving towards with the very articulate vision that Eliane painted is where it's no longer just these, project developers who are far and few, who've traditionally been in the agricultural sector, but I think cooperatives and grassroots, self-help groups and women groups, and all of these organizations are going to be these intermediaries playing this role. And what's going to be really important is from the decentralized world, we support them with the information that is needed for the handholding. Because the project developers, this is part of what they've done for several decades, and they know this. But in some ways, the world and the climate is changing so much that we can all learn from each other, all world over. So a farmer in India can learn from practices in Thailand of growing paddy and rice cultivation practices there. And so theoretically, if there's a field organization there and they have coded in an eco-credit, a farmer cooperative here can take a look at it and say, hey, we also want to be adapting that, and we want our farmers to benefit from that. And so they would get the cash, whatever is the amount in terms of for that particular eco-credit. And we're calling this practice-based methodology, and it's open. Anybody from the community can sort of code it in, and as a community, it's vetted and the verification is decided and it's put on the ledger.
Thanks, Revati. We're coming up on almost just 10 minutes left. Hemendra, there's two questions for you. One is, we have a question in the chat that says, is this all hype? Or like, we've seen things about blockchain, but is it hype? You're an investor, so I want to ask you as an investor, do you think this is hype? And you're, if you say not, why? And then the second piece is, again, as an investor, somebody who's thinking about or seeing kind of organizations across a spectrum in the private sector trying to solve problems, there's always an infrastructure component here that is not necessarily owned by a single organization. So when you think about what are some common pieces of infrastructure that maybe the public sector needs to kind of build or do, things they need to do, what are some of those top line policies or infrastructure contributions that you think would really enable private sector to flourish in this new space? So hype, and what's the wraparound set of public infrastructure?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, on the hype question, I would say 80% is real and probably 20% is hype. And what is real is the impact that I'm seeing on the farming communities. Just with digitalization, forget the Web3 for a minute, but with simple digital applications, with digital payments, with the sort of smartphone-led quality assaying of commodities and stuff like that, which is, I would say, the first step for a farmer to connect with the digital world and get best out of it. I think there's a lot of impact, which I'm seeing on an average, maybe 10 to 30% increase in income on a per hectare basis. I think there are enough empirical evidences which says that it's for real. And I have no doubt, if you look at the digital solutions in India, the adoption rate is about 15 to 20% among farming communities, which is about 20 million farmers. And we have 150 million farmers in India alone. And there are 500 million farmers, smallholder farmers across the world. So just imagine if, it becomes all pervasive. I'm hopeful in next maybe 3 to 5 years, you'll see at least 80-90% penetration of these solutions among farmers. So that's going to change farming forever. How the food is going to be produced, how it's going to be stored, how it's going to be processed, how it is going to be distributed, and also how it is going to be consumed. I think that's the impact that we're going to see, reducing food losses. We talked about climate challenges, hopefully addressing some of those climate challenges in that process. So I think that's the real part. Now, the hype part, I would say the valuations. As an investor, unfortunately, the unicornism is the flavor. Every startup wants to become a unicorn, and as VCs, we should take the blame for hyping that up too much. And I don't think the valuations are in the right place. So there's a huge disconnect between the valuation that a VC gives and the valuation which a public market gives. We're already seeing correction in tech stocks, not in agri, but across sectors, in Indian market, in the US market also. So I think that's the hype part which needs to be corrected. I'm sure it will happen in the next few months, I guess. On the second question, I think that's a very important question on public data sets. I think that's extremely important for mainstreaming this solution. The biggest cost for any startup is the data collection. 80% time, resources, money going into data collection, data cleaning, data authentication, which I don't think is their core capability. The capability is to play with the data and so throw some interesting insights for farmers, for the value chain players. So I think that's where public data sets become extremely important. Then they are there. I think Ricken knows about it. They are either lying with the federal government or the state government or the state agriculture university. I think we need to figure out a way how do we standardize it, how do we make it interoperable, how do we build governance and data around data sharing, data privacy. I think that's the core part of it. But to begin with, the farm ID, the farmer ID, that's what I call the foundational layer of any public digital agri stack. I think that is something we as a country are ready. We need to probably build some bit of architecture around it, but that can throw open a lot of opportunities, and then you can build multiple layers over and above it, which can really solve a lot of challenges which farmer faces in terms of access to market, access to input, access to data, access to credit, access to insurance. So yeah, I'm a firm believer that government or the public ecosystem need to invest a lot, and there is already some tailwinds, at least in India, and I'm hopeful that that can potentially change the pace at which these innovations are going to evolve and being adopted by the farmers.
Thanks, Amandra. Ricken, I'm going to come to you to kind of give some concrete examples of how Digital Green is trying to contribute to both the infrastructure side and sort of this new Web3 space that we've been talking about. And then because of time, I'm just going to put all of our speakers kind of on notice that I'm going to come to you each for last words after Ricken's done. And on the last words, I want you to think about there's a question here about who's going to win. Is it going to be farmers or is it going to be consumers that win more? I didn't put it in the right way. The person who asked the question had a better way of framing it, but who's going to benefit more? Is it going to be farmers, the sort of farm side or the fork side? So would love to have a sort of your 2 cents on that, but also what do we need to do to make sure that farmers do get to benefit, I guess is the second part. So in your closing remarks. So Ricken, over to you, and feel free to do your closing remarks at the same time, but some concrete topics that we can talk about from Digital Green side.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think one of the challenges that we've seen is that there is a lot of data being collected by different actors. Of course, it varies across different countries, India versus Ethiopia versus Kenya. There's obviously a great degree of variation. But most of this data today is being mostly collected and used at an institutional level. And the farmers, to this question, are largely not part of even those equations. And so that's where we see a real need to support these farmer organizations with capacity and digital tools and systems so that they can actually be part of these ecosystems and have voice and consent in the process. The pieces of the puzzle that Digital Green is working on are, one, in terms of how can this data exchange take place in a way that can codify the rules in which a data provider wants to share their data in a protected way to whoever the data consumer is, and have that be enforceable in software. And that's a system that we have developed open source called FarmStack, and that we're looking to enable not just these transactions of data between B2B players who are sharing data, but also these farmer organizations themselves. And one of the pieces of the puzzle there is to say, how can we create a farmer data wallet of sorts so that these farmers and farmer organizations can have a decentralized way in which they can store their data and have a mechanism to consent to having that data shared to third parties of their choice via systems like the FarmStack connector setup that we've established so that they really have control over their own data.
Thanks, Ricken. And that's a good example of what I was talking about. What do we need to do to make sure that farmers actually do get to benefit? I'm going to go in the order we've had. So I'll go Elian, Hemendra, Revathi. In terms of like, what do we need to do? We have 3 minutes left. Appreciate your comments. What do you want to leave people with?
In terms of the food metaverse, it's how do we connect the food metaverse with our need to live within planetary boundaries? So having as sustainable, climate resilient food production systems, having efficient, sustainable value chains where we know carbon footprint at each step and we're minimizing the carbon footprint at each step, and that we're producing healthy, climate smart foods that are being consumed so that we also have healthy populations. So how do we create governance systems so that that metaverse benefits everyone for a healthier collective community?
Awesome. Thanks for bringing the food systems lens back. Thank you. Hemendra.
Yeah, I think you asked a very pertinent question. Who's going to win, consumer or the farmer? I think both can win. What we need to do, there are 10 layers in between. We need to shrink it to maybe 5 layers so that they can talk to each other, they can share the data, and I think that's where everyone will win, and hopefully will have a lot of data generated, which can even drive a lot of ecosystem players to participate in the value chain. Farmer can high share of the consumer price. It's about 30% right now in India. It can potentially move to 60%.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, really huge opportunity. Revathi.
Thank you. This is a very well moderated session, and I really enjoyed it. To round it out, I think I want to just highlight the importance of the tools we're talking about here in terms of the power of having an open source farmer data wallet that Digital Green can develop, and the importance of it. What we do not need is what Google was for the internet, something similar in the agricultural sector. This impacts, 60% to 70% of the world, and very vulnerable population, and this will impact their livelihood directly. So what we need as much as we are talking about technology, is the stack that the people own or at least have a stake in some way. And as technologists, we often forget that. And I think this is my call to technologists to really be intentional about the way we build these solutions and to think about all the aspects that Hemendra actually mentioned in terms of data standards and making sure, even if you're in the private sector, that the different solutions sort of talk to each other and the data is meaningful because it builds on each other and what everybody knows, and to really make use of public data sets to enrich them more while keeping people's privacy in mind, and to really build an ecosystem of agricultural and food data around here, which weaves in meaningfully the climate and sustainability standards, like Eliane mentioned. I think it's totally possible, and it's going to take a concerted effort. And I'm looking forward to it tomorrow where that happens.
Thanks, Revathi. And just want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Riken, Eliane, Hemendra, Revathi. This has been super informative, and thank you to the participants that were adding questions to the chat. We are all accessible, I think, on the Hova app as well, so people can feel free to send extra messages, and just really appreciate your engagement and hope that we come back here in a year and we're talking about even more concrete examples and more people using these tools. So thank you, everyone, and thanks to the organizers for allowing us to structure this.